Okay, so a couple of years ago I started playing this game with my friends called Stardew Valley. After its release in 2016, I had more than a few people recommend the game to me, describing the experience as a relaxing farming game where you can befriend the people in the nearby town. I thought it sounded interesting, but 18-year-old me was too focused on graduating high school and starting college to begin a game I would end up sinking hundreds of hours in. Besides, if I wanted a similar experience, I could always go back and play, say, Minecraft, right? Admittedly, the way the gameplay was described to me didn't entice me enough to even try it out. It was only until summer of 2020, smack in the middle of a worldwide pandemic, that I decided that a relaxing experience was precisely what I needed. I picked up the game alongside my friends, we played for a while, and after they took a break from the game, I started up my own single-player files and played to my heart's content, really taking the time to absorb all the lore and the little details the game had to offer. I ended up playing the game every day for about 8 months straight and eventually became my favorite game of all time. Since then, I decided it was only a matter of time before I checked out other games in the farming simulation genre. After some research, I came up with an interesting proposal for myself. Instead of simply picking up new farming sims that came out over time, I could also explore the birth of a very niche genre and why I became so attached to it. From the history, how each franchise influenced and shaped one another, how Stardew Valley came out on top, the structure of the genre to what defines a life farming simulator. These are the things that interest me the most, so they are what I'm going to be focusing on for today. While the history of farming simulators is pretty straightforward, what influenced those type of games is admittedly a bit more complicated. You see, as far as we know, simulation games have existed since even before the birth of the commercial video game industry, with titles such as the Sumerian game in 1964 or Lemonade Stand in 1973, both economy and business simulators for the IBM 7090 and Apple II respectively. By the late 70s and early 80s, most games were considered to be simulators. After all, what was Pong if not a table tennis simulator? But what would define the same genre in the most definitive and modern sense for many players was SimCity, released in 1989 by Maxis, a city management simulation game where you build infrastructure, design roads in a city, and deal with natural disasters. Here we can appreciate the interaction between the two biggest pillars of modern simulation games: time management and resource management. As we know, simulation games have come a long way since their inception and have taken over other areas in gaming besides that of management or planning. The subgenre of life simulation games was technically a thing while sim games were just coming on up, with titles like Little Computer People in 1985, where you could interact with characters on the screen but no win conditions were presented. Life simulation games today like The Sims and Animal Crossing might provide a good idea of what defines a life simulation game. Playing as one or more characters in a well-established setting, often interacting with other characters, whether that be other player-creator characters or NPCs. A big part of what makes these types of games so engaging is how immersive they can be, pulling the player in to experience a whole new world, whether that be a more down-to-earth, realistic experience or a more fantastical experience or somewhere in between. Combining both the time and resource management aspects of early simulation games and the social aspect of life simulation games is how we arrive at farming simulation games. These games, also known as light farming simulators, farm life sims, or farm sim RPGs, came to be from the inception of the Harvest Moon franchise. In 1986, a game by the name of Bokuyo Monogatari was released in Japan for the Super Famicom, releasing later in North America and Europe for the SNES under the name Harvest Moon. Created by Yasuhiro Wada and publishing company Victor Interactive Software, known today as Marvelous Inc., it was translated and distributed to Western audiences by publishing company Natsume, who gave it the Harvest Moon name. As far as we know, this game was the very first of its kind in the market, thereby creating a farming simulation subgenre under life simulation games, themselves a subgenre under the umbrella of simulation games as a whole. The game consisted of a player character, a young man who inherited a farm from his late grandfather, working to restore and maintain the farm while building relationships with the local townsfolk. An RPG about farming, if you will. The core gameplay loop focuses on the decisions the player makes in regards to how much time, money, energy, and resources they should place on different aspects of their farm and surrounding areas to progress along the story of the game. You see, you have about 2.5 years to accomplish everything you want to do before the game ends and getting one of multiple endings after being evaluated by your father. While you can do pretty much anything while playing, what many consider to be the true best ending is the one where you marry one of the villagers, have 2 kids, get tons of cash, get all power berries, you get the idea. You basically want to be the best at the end of the day, and you have a deadline to do everything you want to do, so you better play well or else you're gonna die alone and sad and your dad will scream at you about being a disappointment. And the first time was bad enough. The game works on an in-game timer that is either paused when you enter buildings, by entering your inventory or menu, or under specific circumstances. The days change as you go to sleep, saving at the end of the day in most entries of the series. This is to say, most farming sims do not operate in real-life time like popular life sim Animal Crossing. Managing the tools and items in your limited inventory, trying to guess what gifts would be best for which characters, figuring out how much time and energy to spend in foraging and mining, and precisely when to do it, at what time of day, during which season, these are all part of the strategy elements that the gameplay offers and where most of the challenge comes from. However, when a lot of people think of farming simulators, they mostly think of relaxing in the simple farm town life. Tending to animals, watering crops every day, talking to people and learning about their lives, their story and their relationships. This is a big component of what truly sells the game to its core audience. With the game gaining a small yet dedicated audience, it got a couple of sequels on both the Game Boy and Game Boy Color, as well as a Nintendo 64 with the release of Harvest Moon 64. The series then kept releasing games quite often, mostly for Nintendo consoles, although there are some PlayStation exclusives in the mix. To this day, the franchise continues under the name Story of Seasons, providing similar gameplay from game to game, with a few minor changes in both mechanics and story. While the Harvest Moon franchise had been somewhat successful in the years that followed the first few initial releases, it wasn't until the mid-2010s when the genre really started to become more prevalent and even mainstream. You see, Marvel's and Natsume had this continuous developer-publisher relationship where they would release Harvest Moon games quite frequently and for a number of different platforms. In 2006, they published the first of the Rune Factory games, which producer Yoshifumi Hashimoto described as Harvest Moon, where you wield a sword. Essentially, a farming simulator with major fantasy elements. In 2012, Marvelous broke up with Natsume, who decided to keep the name Harvest Moon for themselves to make their own line of farming sims, so Marvelous chose the name Story of Seasons for their line of games. Up to 2016, there had really only been 3 farming simulation series, all made by companies that were closely related to one another. Sure, there were multiple entries in all of the series, but none of them compartmentalized all of the best aspects of farming simulators in a neat and satisfying fashion, leaving fans of not just the franchise but the entire genre begging for a game to beat all farming games. So, what happened in 2016? Well, Stardew Valley happened. Created by sole developer Eric Barone, also known as Concerned Ape, he began development in 2012 to add something to his resume after graduating college and as a fan of the Harvest Moon series who was sad to see the franchise go in the direction it was going in. As an indie dev in the mid-2010s, making a game in an incredibly niche video game market, he was expecting to sell maybe 10,000 copies. He sold 10 million. The game sold more than Christianity and launched the obscure genre into the mainstream, immediately inspiring more and more farming simulators to come out, almost all of which claim to be inspired by Stardew Valley, not Harvest Moon or Story of Seasons. How did this happen? Well, the Story of Seasons franchise was worn pretty thin at the point of Stardew Valley's release, not to mention that the success of the title was uncertain since Marvelous split with Natsume. The games had never sold amazingly well, nothing too bad, most entries had a few 100,000 sales under the belt, but it was nothing compared to the millions of copies Stardew Valley had sold, even in the first week since its release. The fact that Stardew Valley was released on PC and later on many other platforms, including mobile, made it very accessible, whereas Story of Seasons games were almost exclusively released for either Nintendo or Sony, limiting their reach. Plus, a new Harvest Moon or Story of Seasons game would come out every 1 to 3 years at $40 to $60, with Stardew Valley being offered everywhere at just $15, $5 if you were getting it on mobile. It just made Stardew Valley the farm sim experience outside of casual farming simulators like Farmville or heavy farming simulators like Giant Software Farming Simulator series. A lot of dedicated fans to the Story of Seasons and Rune Factory games first brushed off Stardew Valley's existence as a mere copycat or even straight up rip-off of their beloved franchise. But today, even the most loyal fans of the real farming sim games have to admit, Stardew Valley is simply the better game. Well, that's the general perception at least, you don't have to agree with it of course. Fans of Rune Factory will swear to hell and back that their games are better, and I can't refute that since I've never played a Rune Factory game. But I've met plenty of players who have hundreds of hours in Friends of Mineral Town or Trio of Towns and only a few deaths in Stardew Valley, who of course prefer their more pure Story of Seasons experience while admitting that Stardew Valley simply has better mechanics. That's entirely valid. But how exactly is Stardew Valley different from the Story of Seasons games it took inspiration from? While old Story of Seasons games had pretty dark storylines and some fantasy elements, Stardew Valley cranked it up to 11, delivering the same type of gameplay with a grittier, almost eerie-like atmosphere to it. A farm sim RPG with an actual antagonist and a way to defeat said antagonist. You didn't have to do so, however. Unlike a lot of older games in the genre, Stardew Valley did not end. It has a soft evaluation, and as of the latest update, it has a way to achieve the true endgame through the perfection tracker. But the game doesn't ever end, it just keeps going. With no true deadline and no rush to do things, the possibilities are endless. You can establish your own goals and your own deadlines, and you can drop and pick up the game whenever you desire. You could already do that with other games in the genre, but with Stardew Valley, it definitely felt more like you were playing a game rather than doing chores. I've heard people say that Stardew Valley is both easier because of the addition of counters and sprinklers, and harder because the day goes on too fast. But the reality is that this is what makes this game so good. The balancing of mechanics, both traditional and modern, to make Stardew the definitive farm sim experience. Before I discovered Stardew Valley, my favorite game of all time was Minecraft. That's right, I was one of those kids. I've been playing Minecraft since the 1.8 beta, back when Hunger and the Ender Dragon were just added and there was no recipe book for what you could craft. Everything had to either be memorized or looked up, in that specific aspect of the game, where it would just throw you into a world with just enough information to let you enjoy yourself. I really appreciated that. No hand-holding, just Cheeto dust and blocks. Farming sims, and really any kind of game with building management, have some sandboxy elements to it, allowing the player to explore the area they are given and letting them change said area to their heart's desire. However, no farm sim offers as much freedom as Stardew Valley does, allowing the player to interact with the townspeople in pretty creative ways, being able to place machines and chests and items of all kinds pretty much everywhere in town and giving the player no starting buildings, but a lot of land to build on. Basically, the mayor throws you onto your farm and tells you good luck. Sure, there is some benefit to already having the buildings present in your farm, like in some Story of Seasons games, where you can more readily streamline the process of barnkeeping. But personally, nothing beats the satisfaction of working towards gathering all the gold and materials needed to build your first coop, watching the local carpenter painstakingly build it from the ground up into the final result. There is something very cathartic about how this game makes you feel when you accomplish just about anything. Sure, some would argue that giving the player the freedom to do what they want ultimately sacrifices some of the story elements that a more linear and limited experience can deliver better. While there is certainly some truth to that statement, I personally disagree. Speaking of the story, at the risk of saying something highly nonsensical and controversial, and I advise you to brace yourself, my favorite part of Stardew Valley is the characters. Yeah, I know, right? They might not be the most fleshed out, at least according to the detractors, but they are a lot more complex than a lot of games within the genre and provide the player a lot of background and story that they can play around with. There's hard events for both romanceable and non-romanceable characters, giving a lot of context to the way certain townspeople act, and not just the ones you can marry. They are so well balanced with one another and provide a lot of options for the player to interact with. If you want a nicer, simpler, and more straightforward storyline, maybe with less fantasy and more idealism, then you are more than welcome to try other games in the genre. But there's a reason why Stardew Valley has stayed on top for so many years, even with the emergence of new games made by smaller indie developers that follow a similar beat with their own style and stories. In fact, two indie farm sims that I'm excited for are Roots of Pacha and Coral Island, both providing unique takes to the usual farm life storylines, with mechanics that match the world that they are set in. Related games that may not fit the genre perfectly but are great nonetheless include My Time at Portia, Littlewood, Forager, Graveyard Keeper, Sakuna, Spiritfarer, amongst others. I'm always a big fan of the crafting survival games where exploration and item management are the name of the game, but that might steer too far off the scope for this video. That's not to say I don't enjoy the company of the Story of Seasons franchise. I love the charm and the challenge of the old games, and while the chibi style might not be my favorite, I still really want to get my hands on the remake of Friends of Mineral Town. There are features in these games that will probably never see the daylight in a Stardew Valley game, like breeding animals of a certain quality or rival marriages. But that's precisely why these games still have a place in the genre, even if they can never hope to be as successful as the game that was inspired by them in the first place. They are sweet and a lot simpler than Stardew, and provide a different kind of enjoyment that I will always welcome. The Rune Factory games look pretty fun too, giving the player different settings and mechanics to play around with than your standard farming simulator. If you're more into the action and the farming, I strongly suggest checking these out. Because of this, I've decided that I want to try to play as many games in the genre as I possibly can. From the old Harvest Moon games to the newer Story of Seasons titles to every Rune Factory entry to the indies that came after Stardew, they all have a story to tell and something to add to the genre. All in all, a lot of what adds to the charm of a farm sim RPG is how much it shares with others in the genre. Stardew took a lot of mechanics and events from the original Friends of Mineral Town in A Wonderful Life. Pioneers of Olive Town has roots in my time at Portia's more industrial type of play, and Coral Island has clearly taken after Stardew's mine and combat system and remade it in its own style. The crossover of mechanics and references from game to game makes each game in the farm sim genre feel a lot more familiar in a sense. No one game feels like it's stepping too far or taking too much from one another, and they all feel like they all have a place in the world. Now let's zoom as Harvest Moon. That's a topic for another video.